So, we'll start this stream today by talking about differences between localization and translation. What's what is not what, and why you shouldn't confuse these two terms and concepts. My name is Iryna Lebedyeva. What I do is I localize digital content for over 15 years now. So I suggest to discuss the following points. The first one being the stages of localization. Whether it's possible to localize without translation at all. And basically, why is it so difficult to localize content when you're talking about languages with genders and declinations and localization. What we mean by that is when we have a digital product or a service and we plan to launch them in new markets, where you have a product, and when we say a digital product, we mean a web service, a website, a digital app, a video game, or sometimes subtitles and closed captions. Over the next 20 minutes, we will dive in. We will use the following terms: digital content, localizability, and internationalization. So if you plan your career, to have a career in the localization field, I suggest that you get through these terms, what they mean. If you want to do that in details, I suggest the Washington University Professional Certification Program. It's an exceptional program available at edX. So let's start finding out differences between localization and translation by having a look at the stages of the localization process. The stages, by the way, that's let's just say that's a set of basic and generalized stages. Not each stage of that is necessary, and this process itself is not a linear process. Well, we always start by creating digital content, but the rest of the processes not necessarily follow this stage in that exact sequence. For instance, if we're switching over to the next stage, if something goes wrong, we can improve the content and send this content back to the authors. The four basic stages are creating the digital content itself. Why this stage is included into the localization process? Because when you're doing this, you have to be aware of the localization and you have to prepare it for further localization. For instance, there's this process called internationalization. It means when at the program code stage we implement certain capabilities of using local date formats, local currency formats, and this process lets us automatically convert this information for the end user automatically. Also, the content authors usually add some comments, some visual context, to facilitate a high-quality localization. After that, the files are sent to some other experts, professionals, to prepare the digital content. That's the next stage. This is where we hold the initial testing of the content for localizability, whether it's suitable for localization. At this step, we highlight variables, we lock them, and we pass the files to the next stage. The next stage being adaptation, translation, and editing or revision. So working with the regional aspects of the content. As you can see, I've highlighted translation here. Because, first of all, translation is just one step in this localization process. And this is the big difference between translation as a smaller process from localization as a bigger process. Also, translation is not necessarily included into the localization process itself, and we will talk about this a bit later. Finally, when content is created, prepared, adapted, and or translated and or revised, we're moving on to the linguistic and functional testing. If at this stage we find out that the final version of the content is not suitable for end use, or if there are any problems, the content is then returned to the content creation stage or content preparation stage. These are the main stages, and we can go through them cyclically in several cycles or loops. Now I'm going to show a couple of real-life cases, real-life examples, so that you have a better understanding of what I'm talking about. That's one of the examples of creating the digital content. The screen is split into two areas, example 1 and example 2. As you can see, example 1 is the Excel file with two columns. First one being like a technical code for the row, and then the next one is the content itself. Since the rows are quite short, the linguist might not have enough information to take the correct decision when he or she is thinking about the options on how to translate this content. So the bigger part, where it says example 2 or sample 2, this is how the Excel file for localization should look like if we're talking about creating content with localization in mind. We can see that there's this service string or technical string. Then in the red box we have the content to be localized, followed by comments in the next column, where this string is going to be used. You can see that comments and explanations are bigger. They take more place than the content to be localized itself. That's normal. That's completely how it should be. And then we have the visual part of this content, so that the localizer could see how potentially these strings or this web page is supposed to look. That allows them to take the correct decision when localizing. This is an example of the preparation stage for digital content. Here you can see something that localizer call bare content. So that's the content or raw content. That's the content that wasn't prepared. That's the text to be translated plus certain technical symbols, elements, web page style elements, etc. It's very important, it's crucial to convert this content into something that looks like this on the right hand side, where all the technical sections, technical elements are locked. That simplifies the work of the localizer, because that removes all the extra unnecessary bits, and it offers less chance to damage certain technical things that are difficult to restore in the future. And secondly, the localizer is not his or her attention is not spread all over this place where if he's working with the text on the left-hand side. This is why it's very important to conduct this preparation step. It allows you to start working on the file, bringing usability to the next level, and that leads to higher quality. If your translator can work comfortably, the end quality is going to be higher. The next stage is adaptation. Adaptation, translation, and revision. Adaptation to the locale. This is what we do normally, but it's not necessary to be conducted, just like the translation step. If we adapt content in French, a French originated content, if it's adapted for the Canadian market, we use certain different words. There is a slight difference in the punctuation between French and Canadian French. Also, there's certain different date formats, certain different currency formats, but the translation in itself, in this case, is not done. This is why we say that translation is a step that's widely used in localization, but it's not necessarily there. While revision of the final content, whether that's adapted or translated, that is a mandatory step, and we never skip it. As for linguistic and functional testing, this is a small example of what it looked like, what happened to it, and what's the end result looks like. This is the example of localizing of a learning program on a web platform. The web platform has apps for Android and iOS, and in one of the sections the learning materials were presented in a visual form, followed by the title of the material, and then an instruction of what to be done with this material, whether that's watch, read, or listen, and that was followed by the number of minutes that it would take a person to go through this content. It was localized into Ukrainian like this. Literally the words watch video, the time variable followed by the concatenated minutes. When we were conducting testing, we found out that this string is too long on certain smartphone models, and the text extends past the visualization area. So we decided to make the interface a bit more straightforward, a bit more fluent, and we've replaced text with icons. Icons for video, the open book as obviously reading, and then the volume icon that looks like a speaker. So that's the end version, and the localization result. The localization itself looked like replacement of text by an image.
So I decided to go with this example to illustrate how localization is not always about the text, and that sometimes it can be about the images. This is how you transform the meaning to make it more usable for the end user. And so the localizer should always put themselves in the shoes of that end user and try to look at as many scenarios as possible. So, when we localize, naturally there will be challenges on the way, especially when it comes to the inflective languages. And sometimes we work with the project without any specific guidelines or requirements or end testing of the digital content, which leads to some typical challenges. And the main source of those challenges is the lack of understanding, I mean by the parties, by the customer, by the company that performs the assignment, when they fail to understand that localization is not the same as translation. These are different processes that require different approaches. So what are those basic challenges? They can be grouped as follows into language-related, communication-related, and technology-related. When it comes to language, normally this means having to work with certain grammar structures, such as in Ukrainian and in other inflective languages, where you have to agree the gender with the number, etc. And so when you need to make all those agreements where the string does not allow you to apply all those different options, simply because there is no technical possibility to do that, this is where the localizer has to somehow transform this original or source, as we call it, string, in a way that the translation could respond according to or adjust to all those different scenarios. Like on this slide, for example, where I highlighted some of those pronouns. For example, they, which in English is gender neutral, and it would require some effort when you translate it into Ukrainian. So if you look at these examples, you can see how the localizer failed to adequately process this aspect and try different scenarios for the variables. Hence, this phrase that looks a bit weird when you put the data, when you insert what's missing. The second example illustrates how the localizer put some hard work into processing the segment, and the output phrase looks quite natural, regardless of how you fill those variables. Moving on, when we work with the variables, with the scenarios and certain constraints, such as having to adjust the length of the string, making sure that the fonts agree, things like that. These are the technical aspects, and they could also be associated with certain challenges. That is why when we localize, those who localize usually know that there are so-called localization engineers who handle things like that. And so, as you can see, the result can be a bit different if you compare these two pieces of text, where one of them was processed by the engineer using a certain filter. Actually, your context, that is, and if it is properly prepared, is essential to ensure the quality of the end result, and it helps you save considerable time on the testing and on the related processes. Although I know that some clients, they try to make this the responsibility of the manager or someone else, which can lead to some unexpected results and can cost you more hours. Which brings me to our next group of challenges that are related to communication. Normally, every localization project has a whole team working on it. And this team usually includes three kinds of experts: the authors of the content, the translation and localization team, including the managers, the translators, and the editors, and the tech team, including the programmers, localization engineers, and testers. And so in my line of work, I usually see that the source of the problems is the lack of communication. When there is good communication inside the team, it helps the authors better understand the specificity of the language and handle what I've already mentioned in a more effective way, keeping in mind the purposes of the localization. For the coders, understanding the specificity of the language helps code better. And if you have some experience in the field of localization, you might have already seen some of those strings that you are being sent for translation that look like parts of some segments between the variables, not even making one comprehensive string, but just isolated. And so when you have good communication with the coders, you can explain that the word order is different in the target language, or if there are some other things that they need to keep in mind, or you can ask them to somehow differentiate between the genders, which can be essential if you're looking to design a gender-adequate copy. So unless you have good communication and collaboration between the three groups of experts, you will not be able to ensure the quality of your digital content. The chances will be very slim. So if you're planning to localize, and if the system that you use for localization has some kind of a feedback function, such as the chat or something else, I encourage you to use it, to ask questions, to agree on things. And by the way, the localizer usually acts as the language consultant for the client, because the client might not have the skills of the target language, and they can have no idea that there are certain constraints or issues that they need to keep in mind, making sure there is a separate code or even a separate piece of content for that. Anyway, I guess that's about it. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to your questions, if you have any. And I'll be happy to see you as a Ukrainian localizer or someone working internationally. And these are my contact details, just in case. If you'd like to share something at some point or ask a question later. Thank you for this presentation. My question comes from my experience. Did you manage to have to come up with some kind of strategy for the Ukrainian language, for the vocative case in Ukrainian? Thank you for this question. At some point, we had a whole team of experts working on this problem, because this is not exclusively a Ukrainian problem, something related to the Ukrainian language exclusively. So we convinced the coding team that this evocative case is essential, and it requires a separate string. And then for the Ukrainian language, when you fill out those fields, like first name, middle name, last name, there's a separate line for that, for the address. And so for the client to specify how they would like to be addressed. And so if the client's name is Yulia in Ukrainian, then the respective form of the name in the vocative case should be inserted in that field. Just give me a second. I'll go back to one of the slides. Slide number 14. Yes, this one, thank you. There, see, dear, and then insert the first name of the client. It was rebundled with a variable containing the contact detail and the details and the name of the user in the vocative case. So it was a very thorough process on all levels. Any other questions? Yes, hello. Could you please tell me when do you put the dot after min or minutes, abbreviation for minutes? So if usually in your day-to-day communication you could end that with a dot, but normally you don't when it expressly refers to the time. So it is not a mistake if I put that dot. Well, if it's a technical document, according to the standards, you never put the dot, because there are standards that apply to the physical units of measurement. And according to those standards, you don't put the dot. Thank you. Thank you for this presentation, Iryna. Your presentations are always very interesting. My question is about localizing the tested content. Are there any regulations that apply? Because when I get the task, I look at the mobile app, I make the screenshots, and then I do the report the way I see it. Are there any regulations that apply in this industry? Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yes, indeed, there are instructions that are supposed to be provided by your customer, and this by your client rather. And these instructions have to contain all the scenarios and all the results expected by performing certain action. But when you're looking through the text, but you don't know what to reference by, you won't be able to spot it. Another point is in comprehensive and complex cross-platform solutions, you have certain you have a thing that contains different roles for different users. If we're talking about a learning platform, that might be a role of an ordinary user, or if it's a mentoring platform, that might include a mentor role, the administrator's role, clients or customers' role that connects their employees to this learning system. And all these roles are supposed to be tested separately in a separate mode with separate expected results. These instructions, these guidelines, normally strictly provided by the client. Since you've mentioned it, maybe you know this already, but it's never hurts to reiterate. There are web apps that allow you to use your browser window to test your app for Android, for iOS. Those are emulators of different operational systems. If you need to test an iOS app, you don't need to have an iPhone necessarily. You can use an emulator for that. Any more questions? There were some more people who wanted to ask questions. No, not anymore. Okay. Thank you, Iryna. Thanks a lot.